I should have known peace wouldn't last the second I said his name out loud. I was standing in the middle of a cheap wooden cabin 3 hours from the nearest gas station, boots still wet from the drive, a half-empty bottle of bourbon hanging from my fingers like a bad decision I hadn't fully committed to yet, telling myself this trip was about healing, about silence, about finally letting go of Liam Carter. And for a moment it almost worked because the place was quiet in that heavy, snow-muted way, like the world had decided to leave me alone for once. No texts, no calls, no memories loud enough to drown me. Just the hum of the heater and the faint creak of old wood settling into the cold. And I remember thinking maybe this was it. Maybe this was how you move on. You run far enough that the past can't find you. You breathe in air that doesn't smell like them. You stop replaying the same arguments in your head. You stop wondering what you could have done differently. You stop caring. Except I didn't stop caring. Not really. Because even as I set my bag down and kicked the door shut behind me, his name slipped out again, quieter this time, like it belonged in the room whether I wanted it there or not. And that's when the door creaked open, slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a place you just locked, and I froze, bottle halfway to my lips, heartbeat tripping over itself, because no one was supposed to be here, not for miles, not in this weather, not in this exact cabin I booked weeks ago just to disappear. And then he stepped inside like he'd never left my life at all, snow clinging to the shoulders of his coat, breath visible in the cold air, eyes locking onto mine with that same steady intensity one used to read like a language I thought I understood. And for a second I actually thought I'd imagined him, like my brain had finally snapped under the weight of missing someone I wasn't supposed to miss. But then he held up a key, the same cheap plastic tag dangling from it, and said, calm as anything, looks like we booked the same place. And something inside me cracked because of course it had to be him. Of course out of every cabin in every state it had to be the one place I ran to. And I laughed, sharp and wrong. Because what else do you do when the person you're trying to forget walks through your door like fate has a sick sense of humor? Except the storm outside picked that exact moment to slam against the walls, wind rattling the windows, snow swallowing the road I came in on, and suddenly leaving wasn't an option anymore. Not for him, not for me, not tonight, and definitely not with everything still sitting unfinished between us like a conversation we never had the courage to end. You can take the bedroom, I said. Because if I kept my voice steady, maybe my hands would follow. Maybe my chest would stop tightening like it used to whenever he stood too close, like it was doing now, like nothing had changed even though everything had. And Liam just looked at me for a second too long before setting his bag down by the door, snow melting into small dark patches on the wooden floor, and nodded like we were strangers negotiating space instead of two people who used to know exactly how the other took their coffee. And that silence stretched, thin and sharp, until the wind outside slammed against the cabin again, and the lights flickered once, twice, like a warning, and I forced a laugh that sounded wrong even to me, saying something about the storm, about how the forecast did not mention it being this bad, about how I would have picked somewhere else if I knew. And he just said, yeah, like that was enough, like he was not the storm I had been trying to outrun. And I turned away first because I always do. Because looking at him for too long feels like standing too close to something that could pull me back in without asking. And I busied myself in the tiny kitchen, opening cabinets that were already empty, pouring bourbon into a chipped glass like that would make this situation make sense, like it would erase the fact that he was here, breathing the same air, existing in the same few hundred square feet I thought would finally be mine alone. And I told myself not to look at him again, not to notice the way he shrugged off his coat, not to remember how many times I had watched that exact movement from across a room and felt something warm and dangerous settle in my chest. But of course I noticed, of course I remembered. And when he stepped closer to set his keys on the counter, our fingers brushed for half a second, just enough to send something electric and unwelcome through me. And I pulled back too fast, knocking my glass against the edge, bourbon sloshing over my hand. And he reached out automatically, like muscle memory, like habit. Like we had not spent months pretending the other did not exist. And then he stopped himself mid-motion, hand hovering in the air between us. And that was worse, somehow worse than if he had touched me, because it meant he remembered too. And for a second neither of us moved, the space between us filled with everything we were not saying, until I wiped my hand on my jeans and stepped back, putting distance where there should have been none, and saying, too quickly, we can just stay out of each other's way. Like that was possible, like the past could be packed neatly into separate corners of a one-bedroom cabin. And he let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, just something that settled heavy in the air before he said, yeah, sure, and turned toward the bedroom, leaving me alone with the sound of the storm and the realization that being this close to him again did not feel like closure. It felt like stepping back into something unfinished, something I had never actually escaped. I did not realize how loud silence could be until it settled between us, thick and pressing, broken only by the steady hum of the heater and the occasional groan of the cabin shifting under the weight of the storm outside. And I told myself I preferred it this way, that quiet meant safe, that not talking meant not reopening anything that should have stayed buried. But my mind would not cooperate, because it kept replaying every small detail from earlier like it was trying to prove a point I did not want to hear. The way his hand had paused midair, the way he had looked at me like he almost said something and then chose not to. And I hated that I noticed. Hated that part of me was still tuned to him like that, like some reflex I never unlearned. And I took another sip of bourbon just to give my hand something to do, pacing the small living room like it could burn off the tension sitting under my skin, except it did not. It only made me more aware of how small the space really was, how there was no real distance here. No way to pretend we were not sharing the same air, the same night, the same unfinished history, and I told myself to go to bed, to end this day before it got any worse, before I said something I could not take back. But when I walked past the bedroom door, I slowed without meaning to, because I could hear him moving inside, quiet, careful, like he was trying not to make noise, like he was giving me space even when there was not enough to give, and that irritated me more than it should have. Because when did he start being considerate? When did he start holding back instead of pushing forward the way he always used to? And I leaned my head briefly against the wall, closing my eyes, telling myself none of this mattered anymore, that he was just someone I used to know, someone I had already survived losing. Except my chest tightened like that was not entirely true, like something inside me was still waiting for a version of him that no longer existed, and I pushed off the wall before I could think too much about it, heading toward the couch instead of the bedroom because the idea of sleeping in the same space felt too close, too familiar, and I grabbed the extra blanket from the chair, tossing it over myself like that could create a boundary, like fabric could do what distance could not. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm build outside, wind rattling the windows hard enough to make me wonder if the road was already gone, if we were already cut off whether we liked it or not. And for a moment, I almost laughed at how fitting that felt, because of course the universe would trap me here with him. Of course it would force me to sit with everything I had been avoiding, and I shifted under the blanket, trying to get comfortable, trying to find a position that did not remind me of the nights we used to fall asleep too close, legs tangled, breathing in sync like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I exhaled sharply, turning onto my side like I could physically turn away from the memory. Except just as I was starting to drift into something close to sleep, I heard the bedroom door open, soft but unmistakable, followed by his voice, low and hesitant in a way I had never heard before. Ethan, are you awake? For a second I considered pretending to be asleep, just letting the question hang there unanswered so I would not have to deal with whatever came next. But my body betrayed me the way it always did around him, shifting under the blanket, giving me away before I could stop it. And I let out a quiet breath, staring at the ceiling as I answered, yeah, like it did not matter, like he had not just pulled me back from the edge of sleep and into something far more complicated. And there was a pause, long enough that I almost thought he would retreat, that he would leave it at that and go back to the room we were pretending belonged to him alone. But instead I heard his footsteps, slow, careful, approaching the living room like he was walking into something uncertain, and I felt it before I saw him. That shift in the air, that awareness that used to feel natural and now felt dangerous. And when I finally turned my head, he was standing a few feet away, one hand braced lightly against the doorframe, like he needed the support, like this conversation was already harder than he expected, and that alone threw me off, because Liam Carter had never hesitated before, not with words, not with me, and I pushed myself up onto one elbow, forcing my voice to stay neutral, asking, what? like I was not already bracing for impact, like I was not waiting for him to say something that would crack this fragile balance we were holding on to. And he ran a hand through his hair, a small, restless movement that felt too familiar, too human, and said, "The heater is acting weird," which was not what I expected, not even close, and for a second I just stared at him, trying to process the fact that after everything, after all the silence and tension and unfinished history, he woke me up to talk about the heater, and I almost laughed again, softer this time, shaking my head as I sat up fully, pushing the blanket off my shoulders, saying, "It is an old cabin. That is kind of the deal." But he did not move, did not step back, and that was when I noticed it. The faint unease in his expression, the way his eyes flicked toward the window where the storm was still raging, louder now, more aggressive, like it had no intention of letting up anytime soon. And something in my chest shifted, just slightly, because I recognized that look too, the one he tried to hide, the one that only showed up when he was not as in control as he wanted to be, and I swallowed, pushing myself to stand, closing the distance without thinking, drawn by habit more than intention. And for a moment we were too close again, the space between us, narrowing in a way that felt familiar and wrong at the same time. And I reached past him to adjust the thermostat, my arm brushing lightly against his, just enough to make my breath hitch before I could stop it. And neither of us moved away right away, like we both forgot how, like the past had slipped back into place for a split second before reality caught up. And when I finally stepped back, the air felt heavier, charged with something neither of us wanted to name, and he exhaled slowly, watching me in that way that made it impossible to pretend this was just about the heater, just about the storm. And then he said, quieter now, like the words mattered more than he wanted them to, "You are really staying out here?" And I forced a shrug, looking anywhere but at him as I answered, "It is just for one night." Even though we both knew the storm outside was saying otherwise, even though something in his expression told me this was not going to be as simple as one night apart in the same place. "It is not going to be one night," Liam said, and his voice was not sharp or confrontational, which somehow made it worse, because it sounded certain, like he already knew something I was still trying to deny. And I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have, crossing my arms like that would give me something to hold on to, something solid, and I forced a small shrug, saying, "It will clear by morning." Even though the wind outside howled like it had other plans, rattling the windows hard enough to make the glass hum, and he glanced toward it again before looking back at me, his eyes softer now, like he was choosing his words more carefully than he ever used to, and that threw me off in a way I did not want to examine too closely, because Liam had never been careful with me before, not with what he said, not with how close he stood, not with the way he made everything feel so easy until it was not. And I shifted my weight, trying to create space where there was not enough of it, saying, "You can have the bed, I already told you." But he did not move, did not step away, just stayed there like the distance between us was something he was not willing to increase. And for a second the room felt smaller, the air tighter, like the storm outside had found its way in, and he shook his head slightly, almost to himself, before saying, "That is not what I meant." And my chest tightened because of course it was not, because nothing between us was ever that simple, and I looked at him then, really looked, noticing the faint tiredness under his eyes, the way his shoulders were not as squared as they used to be, like something had worn him down in ways I had not been there to see. And that realization hit harder than I expected, because I had spent so long convincing myself he was fine without me, that he moved on easily, that what we had meant less to him than it did to me. And now I was not so sure, and I hated that uncertainty, hated that it made me want to ask questions I had no right to ask anymore. And I broke the silence first, because I always do, because I cannot stand sitting in it too long, saying, "Then what do you mean?" Even though part of me already knew this was not going anywhere safe. And he hesitated, just for a second, before stepping a little closer, not enough to touch, but enough that I could feel the warmth of him, could notice the familiar way he held himself when he was trying to be calm, trying not to push too hard, and that alone made something twist in my chest, because this version of him felt unfamiliar and known at the same time, like I was looking at someone I used to love through a slightly different lens. And he exhaled slowly before answering, "You do not have to pretend you are fine." And the words landed heavier than they should have, simple but loaded, cutting through the surface of everything I had been carefully keeping in place, and I let out a short laugh that did not reach my eyes, shaking my head as I looked away. Because pretending was easier. Because pretending meant I did not have to admit that being here with him, this close, this suddenly, felt like reopening something I never actually closed, and I said, "Quieter now, I am not pretending." Even though the words felt thin the second they left my mouth, and I knew he heard it too, because he did not argue, did not call me out the way he used to, just watched me in silence that felt too understanding, and that somehow made it harder to breathe than if he had just pushed back, because it meant he saw through me anyway, and the storm outside kept building, louder, closer, like it was pressing us into this moment whether we wanted it or not. "You always did that," Liam said quietly, and something in his tone made me look up before I could stop myself, because it was not accusing, not sharp, just certain, like he had been holding that thought for a while and finally decided to let it out, and I frowned slightly, more defensive than I meant to be, asking, "Did what?" Even though part of me already knew, because I could feel it, that old pattern settling back into place, the one where I pretend everything is fine until it is not, and he shifted his weight, eyes flicking down for a second before meeting mine again, like he was choosing his words carefully, and that still felt strange, still felt like a version of him I had not learned yet. And he said, "You say you are okay, even when you are not." And I let out a small breath, half laugh, half disbelief, because of course he would say that. Of course he would still think he knew me that well. And I shook my head, crossing my arms tighter, saying, "People change." Even though the words felt hollow the second they left my mouth, and he tilted his head slightly, not challenging, just observing. And that was worse somehow, because it made me feel seen in a way I was not ready for. And I looked away first, focusing on the window where the snow had started to blur everything outside into nothing, just white and movement, and no clear way out. And I said, "Quieter now. You do not get to call me out like that anymore." Because that felt safer, drawing a line, reminding both of us where we stood, except he did not step back, did not retreat the way I expected, and instead he took a small step closer, enough that I could feel the warmth of him again. That familiar presence that used to feel like home and now felt like something I did not know how to hold on to. And he said, softer now, "I am not trying to call you out." And I swallowed, because the way he said it mattered, the way it lacked the edge I remembered, the way it felt almost careful. And that word echoed in my head louder than it should have, because Liam had never been careful with me before, and that made this moment heavier, more complicated, and I forced myself to look at him. Again, searching his face like I could find the version of him I used to know, the one I could predict, the one who would push until I pushed back. But this version just stood there, steady and quiet, and it unsettled me more than any argument could have. And I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, saying, "Then what are you doing?" Because I needed to understand, needed to place this somewhere that made sense. And he hesitated again, just for a second, before answering. I did not think you would run this far just to be alone." And that hit somewhere deeper than I expected, because it was not judgment, not exactly, just observation, just him noticing something I had not said out loud. And I felt my chest tighten, that familiar pressure building like it always did when I got too close to saying something real. And I looked away again, shaking my head slightly, trying to brush it off, trying to keep things surface level, saying, "It is just a trip." But even I could hear how weak that sounded, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything we had said so far, because it carried everything we were still avoiding, everything unfinished, everything that never got a proper ending. And the storm outside kept rising, wind pressing harder against the cabin, like it was sealing us in, like it was not going to let either of us escape this time, no matter how much we pretended we could. The silence stretched just a little too long, the kind that starts to feel like pressure building under your skin, and I shifted again, restless, like if I kept moving I could avoid whatever this was turning into. Except Liam did not move at all, just stood there watching me with that same quiet focus that used to undo me in ways I never admitted out loud, and I hated that it still worked. Hated that even now it made it harder to keep my guard up, and I let out a breath, sharper than I intended, saying, "You do not know why I am here," because that felt safer, pushing back, creating distance, reminding both of us that whatever he thought he understood was outdated, like everything else between us. But he did not flinch, Did not argue. Just nodded once like he expected that reaction, like he had already considered it, and said, "Then tell me." Simple, direct. No pressure in the words, but something steady underneath them, something that did not leave as much room to deflect as I wanted. And I opened my mouth, ready with something dismissive, something easy, something that would shut this down before it went anywhere real, but nothing came out, because the truth sat too close to the surface, too heavy to shape into something casual, and I looked away instead, jaw tightening as I focused on the floorboards, on anything that was not him, because looking at him made it harder to lie, and I said, quieter now. It does not matter. And there it was again, that pattern he called out, that reflex to shut things down before they could unravel, and I could feel it, the way he noticed, the way his silence shifted slightly, like he was deciding whether to push or step back. And for a second I almost wished he would push, because that was easier to argue, easier to hold on to anger than whatever this was, this careful, measured version of him that did not give me anything clear to fight against. And the storm outside cracked against the cabin again, louder this time, a sharp burst of wind that made the walls creak, and I glanced toward the window instinctively, watching the snow blur everything beyond it into white noise. And for a second it felt like we were completely cut off, like the world outside had disappeared, leaving just this room, this moment, this unfinished conversation neither of us knew how to end. And I rubbed a hand over the back of my neck, exhaling slowly, trying to steady something that felt like it was slipping, and when I spoke again, my voice came out lower, less guarded than I intended. I just needed quiet. And it was not the whole truth, not even close, but it was closer than anything I had said so far, and he caught it. I could tell he did, because his expression shifted just slightly, something softer, something that felt too close to understanding, and that made my chest tighten again, because I was not ready for that. Not from him, not now, and he nodded once, like he was accepting what I gave him without asking for more, at least for now, and said, "Yeah." And that was it. No follow-up, no digging deeper, just that quiet acknowledgement, and somehow that made everything feel heavier, because it meant he was holding back on purpose, and I did not know what to do with that, did not know how to respond to someone who was not pushing me into a corner, and the space between us settled again, not empty but full of everything unsaid, everything waiting, and I realized, standing there with the storm closing in and no way out, that this was not just about being stuck in the same place, it was about being forced to face everything we left unfinished, whether we were ready for it or not. The quiet did not last, not really, because even when neither of us spoke it felt like something was building, slow and steady, like the storm outside finding new ways to press against the walls, and I could feel it under my skin, that restless awareness of him still standing there, still too close, still not leaving. And I told myself to move, to sit back down, to end this moment before it stretched any further, but my feet stayed where they were, like part of me was waiting, and I hated that. Hated how familiar that feeling was, like I had slipped back into an old version of myself without realizing it. And I cleared my throat quietly, forcing a shift, saying, "You should get some sleep." Because that sounded normal. That sounded like something two people sharing a space would say without it meaning anything more. But he did not move right away, just watched me for another second, like he was deciding something. And then he nodded, slow, like he was agreeing to more than just going back to the bedroom, and turned, taking a step away, and I felt it immediately, that small change in the air, the space opening up again, and I should have felt relieved. I told myself I did feel relieved, except my chest felt strangely tight instead, like something had been pulled away too quickly, like I had not been ready for the moment to end even though I had been the one to end it, and I exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over my face as I turned back toward the couch, trying to shake it off, trying to reset, except the second I sat down, the cushion dipped slightly beside me, and I froze, because I had not heard him come back, had not realized he had not actually gone anywhere, and when I turned my head, he was right there, closer than before, close enough that I could see the faint crease between his brows, the way his gaze searched mine like he was looking for something specific, something he was not sure he would find, and my breath caught before I could stop it, the reaction. Automatic, uninvited, and I frowned slightly, more at myself than him, asking, "What are you doing?" even though my voice came out quieter than I intended, like the question mattered more than I wanted it to. And he did not answer right away, just sat there, not touching me but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the steady presence that used to ground me, and now felt like it was pulling me somewhere I was not sure I could go again. And then he said, low and careful, "You look cold." And I almost laughed, because that was such a small thing, such an easy excuse, but the way he said it, the way his eyes stayed on mine, made it clear it was not just about that. And before I could respond, before I could push him away or make a joke or do anything that would put distance back between us, he reached for the blanket draped over my lap, adjusting it slightly, his fingers brushing the edge near my hand, not quite touching but close enough to make my pulse jump. And it was such a simple gesture, so small, so harmless, and yet it landed heavier than anything we had said all night, because it felt like him, like the version of him I remembered, the one who noticed things I did not say out loud, the one who took care in ways that never felt forced. And I swallowed, my throat suddenly tight, because I did not know what to do with that, did not know how to respond to something that felt so familiar and so distant at the same time. And I shifted slightly, not pulling away but not leaning in either, caught somewhere in between, and he let his hand fall back to his side, not lingering, not pushing further, just leaving the space between us charged with something quiet and unresolved. And outside the storm kept raging, louder now, like it was sealing us in, like it was not going to let this moment pass without forcing us to face what was still there, waiting, just beneath the surface. For a moment neither of us moved, the space between us filled with something fragile and unspoken, and I could feel it, the way the air had shifted after something as simple as him adjusting the blanket, like that one small gesture had cracked open a door neither of us had meant to touch. And I stared at his hand where it rested loosely against his knee, noticing the way his fingers flexed slightly, like he was holding himself back from reaching out again. And that realization hit harder than it should have, because it meant this was not one-sided. It meant whatever this was, this pull, this tension, it was still there for him too. And I swallowed, forcing myself to look away, focusing on the far wall like it could ground me, like it could remind me why I came here in the first place. And I said, quieter than before, "You do not have to do that." Even though I was not entirely sure what I meant by that, whether I was talking about the blanket or the way he was sitting here, or the way he was still looking at me like I was something worth understanding. And he let out a small breath, almost a huff of air, like he was caught between saying something and letting it go. And then he said, "I know." And that should have been the end of it. It should have been enough. But he did not move, did not put distance between us, just stayed there like he was choosing this, like he was choosing to stay in the uncomfortable space instead of walking away from it the way we both used to. And that made my chest tighten again, because I did not know how to navigate this version of him, did not know how to respond when he was not pushing, not pulling, just present. And the storm outside cracked louder, a sharp burst of wind that rattled the windows hard enough to make me flinch slightly. And without thinking I glanced toward it, watching the way the snow blurred everything beyond the glass into nothing, just white and movement, and no clear way out. And something about that felt too familiar, too close to how this situation felt, like we were stuck in something we could not see through clearly. And I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself, trying to find something solid to hold on to. And I said, more to fill the silence than anything else, "It is going to be a long night." And he nodded slightly, his shoulder brushing mine just barely as he shifted, the contact so light it could have been accidental. But it lingered for a second longer than it needed to, just enough to send a quiet ripple through me. And I stilled, my breath catching again in that frustrating, automatic way I could not seem to control. And I hated that. Hated how easily he could still affect me without even trying. And I shifted slightly, not pulling away but not leaning in either, caught in that same in-between space we had been circling all night. And then he spoke again, softer now, like the words mattered more than the conversation itself. "You used to hate storms." And that pulled something sharp and unexpected through me, because it was so specific, so small, and yet it carried the weight of memory, of him knowing things about me that most people never noticed. And I let out a quiet breath, my gaze dropping to my hands as I said, "I still do." Because that felt easier than acknowledging the rest of it, easier than admitting that sitting here with him while the storm closed in felt exactly like something I had tried to forget. And for a second neither of us spoke again. Just sat there in the quiet hum of the cabin, the storm pressing in from the outside, and something equally intense pressing in from within, and I realized, with a slow, sinking clarity, that this was not just about being stuck in the same place anymore. It was about being forced to remember everything we once were, whether we were ready to face it or not. Why did you leave like that? The question came out before I could stop it, sharper than anything I had said all night, cutting through the quiet like it had been waiting for its moment. And the second the words landed between us, I felt it. The shift, the way the air changed from fragile to charged, like something had finally crossed the line we had been circling since he walked through that door, and Liam still beside me, his shoulder no longer brushing mine, his body going quiet in a way that told me I had hit something real, something we had both been avoiding. And for a second I almost took it back, almost laughed it off, said I did not mean it. But the truth was I did. I had been holding on to that question longer than I wanted to admit, and now that it was out I could not pretend it did not matter. And he let out a slow breath, looking down at his hands before back at me, like he was deciding how honest to be, and that hesitation alone made my chest tighten, because it reminded me of all the things he never said back then, all the times he chose silence instead of clarity, and I shook my head slightly, a small, frustrated motion, saying, "You do not get to just show up like this and act like nothing happened," because that was easier than admitting how much seeing him again had unsettled me, easier than admitting that part of me still cared enough to ask, and his jaw tightened just slightly, not defensive, not angry, just controlled, and he nodded once, like he understood what I was really saying underneath it, and that only made it harder to breathe, because I did not want understanding, I wanted answers. I wanted something clear to hold on to. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping without meaning to. "You left without saying anything, Liam. You just disappeared." And there it was, the part one had not said out loud until now. The part that had sat heavy in my chest every time I thought about him. Every time I tried to convince myself I was better off without him. And he exhaled again, slower this time, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting mine. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than I expected, steadier, but carrying something underneath it that made me pause. "I did not think you would stay," and I blinked, thrown off by that, because it was not the answer I expected, not even close, and I frowned slightly, trying to process it, asking, "What does that even mean?" Because it sounded like an excuse, like a deflection, and I was not in the mood for either, but he did not look away, did not dodge it, just held my gaze and said, "You were already pulling away before I left." And that landed harder than I wanted it to, because part of me knew there was truth in it, even if I did not want to admit it, even if I had built my version of the story around him being the one who walked out first. And I opened my mouth to argue, to push back, to tell him he was wrong. But the words stuck, caught somewhere between pride and honesty, and that hesitation was enough for him to see it, enough for the silence to shift again, heavier now, more complicated. And I leaned back slowly, running a hand through my hair as I looked away, because this was not going the way I expected, not the clean argument I thought it would be, not the clear line of blame I had held onto for so long. And the storm outside roared louder, like it was echoing the tension building between us, and I realized, with a slow, sinking feeling, that this was not just about asking a question anymore. It was about everything we never said, everything we misunderstood, everything that had been left unfinished and was now rising back to the surface whether we were ready for it or not. The words sat between us, heavy and unmoving, and I could feel it, the shift from something tense but controlled into something deeper, something harder to step back from, and I exhaled slowly, rubbing my hands together like I could shake off the weight of it. But it did nothing, because Liam's words were still there, echoing. "You were already pulling away," and I hated how easily they slipped under my guard, how they found the cracks I had spent months pretending were not there, and I shook my head, quieter now, less certain than before, saying, "That is not the same thing." Because it was not, because there was a difference between pulling away and walking out, between needing space and leaving without a word, and he did not argue immediately, which only made it worse, because it meant he was listening, actually listening, and I was not used to that, not from him. Not like this, and he leaned back slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped together, like he was grounding himself before speaking, and that alone made my chest tighten again. Because this was not the Liam I remembered, not the one who pushed until things broke, but someone who seemed to be trying not to let them break again. And he said, carefully, "You stopped letting me in before I left." And I looked at him sharply, because that felt too close, too accurate in a way I did not want to acknowledge. And I let out a small, disbelieving laugh, shaking my head, saying, "That does not give you the right to just disappear." And there it was again, the edge in my voice, the part of me that still needed to hold on to that anger, because without it I was not sure what was left. And he nodded, slower this time, like he agreed, like he was not trying to take that away from me. And that only made the tension twist tighter, because I did not know how to argue with someone who was not fighting back. And for a moment we just sat there, the storm outside filling the silence with its steady roar, and I could feel something building again, not sharp like before, but heavier, like it was pulling everything else down with it. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice lower now, less defensive, more tired, saying, "You could have said something." Because that was the part that still lingered, the part that had never made sense. And he looked at me. Then, really looked, and there was something in his expression I had not seen before, something that felt like regret but quieter, less obvious. And he said, "I tried." And I frowned immediately, because that did not line up with anything I remembered, because in my version of things he had just left, just vanished like whatever we had was not worth explaining. And I shook my head, confusion mixing with frustration, saying, "No, you did not." But he held my gaze, steady, and said, "You stopped answering my calls, Ethan." And that hit harder than anything else, because it was not something I could dismiss easily, not something I could twist into the version of the story I had been holding on to. And I blinked, caught off guard, my mind scrambling to line up what he was saying with what I remembered. And for a second everything felt slightly off balance, like the ground under me had shifted just enough to make me question where I was standing. And I looked away, my jaw tightening as I tried to process it, because part of me knew there was truth in that too, even if I had buried it under everything else. And the storm outside surged again, wind pressing hard against the cabin. And I realized, sitting there with him, that this was not just about who left and who stayed. It was about everything in between, everything we missed, everything we misunderstood. And that realization felt heavier than any argument we could have had. For a moment I said nothing, because I could not, because the words he had just dropped into the space between us were still settling, still rearranging something in my head that I had spent months keeping fixed. And I stared at the floor like it might give me something solid to stand on, like it might help me sort through what I remembered and what I chose to remember. And I let out a slow breath, quieter now, less certain, saying, "I thought you stopped trying." Because that was the version I had held on to, the one that made it easier to move on, the one where he gave up first. And he shook his head slightly, not frustrated, not defensive, just tired. And that hit me in a way I did not expect, because it made this feel less like an argument and more like something we both lost without realizing it. And he said, "I did not." Simple, steady, like he had nothing to gain from lying about it now. And I swallowed, my throat tightening as I tried to line up what he was saying with the silence I remembered, the empty calls, the unanswered messages, the slow fade that felt like him walking away piece by piece. And I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling sharply as I said, "Then why did it feel like you did?" Because that was the part that still did not make sense, the part that had stayed with me long after everything else faded. And he shifted slightly beside me, turning more toward me now, his expression focused, like this mattered more than anything we had said before. And he said, "Because you stopped letting me reach you." And that landed differently this time. Not sharp, not defensive, just honest. And I closed my eyes briefly, because that felt too close, too real, like it was brushing against something I had not fully looked at yet. And I let out a quiet breath, saying, "I needed space." Softer now, less like an excuse and more like something I was trying to understand myself. And he nodded immediately, like he accepted that, like he was not arguing with it, and said, "I know." And that should have made it easier, should have settled something. But it did not, because the space between needing space and losing someone completely was not something either of us had known how to handle back then. And I opened my eyes, looking at him again, really looking this time, and I saw it. The same thing I felt, the same uncertainty, The same weight of everything we did not say when we should have, and my chest tightened, because this was not just about who left or who stayed. It was about how we both let it fall apart in slow, quiet ways we did not recognize until it was too late, and I shifted slightly closer without realizing it, drawn in by something I could not quite name, and the space between us narrowed again, not accidental this time, not entirely, and neither of us pulled away. And the storm outside surged louder, wind pressing hard against the cabin like it was trying to get in, like it was echoing the tension building inside, and I said, barely above a whisper now, "We should have talked," because that felt like the simplest truth in all of this, the one thing that might have changed everything. And he let out a slow breath, his gaze steady on mine as he answered, "Yeah." And the word hung there, heavy and unresolved, because it was not just agreement, it was acknowledgement of everything we missed, everything we lost, everything that might have been different if we had just said the things we were saying now. And I realized, sitting there with him, closer than we had been all night, that this was no longer about the past alone. It was about what we were going to do with it now that it was right in front of us again. The space between us felt smaller than ever, like the storm outside had pressed the walls inward just enough to force everything closer, tighter, unavoidable, and I could feel it in the way my breath slowed, in the way I did not move even though I knew I probably should, because this was the point where things either pulled back or crossed a line we could not uncross, and Liam was still looking at me like he was waiting, not pushing, not demanding, just there, steady in a way that made it harder to look away. And I swallowed, my throat tight as I searched for something to say that would make this easier, something light, something safe, but nothing came, because there was nothing safe about this moment, not anymore. And I let out a slow breath instead, my voice quieter than it had been all night as I said, "This does not fix anything," because I needed to say it, needed to remind myself that understanding the past did not magically erase it. And he nodded slightly, like he expected that, like he agreed, and said, "I know." And that should have been the end of it. It should have been enough to create distance again, to pull us back to something manageable, but neither of us moved. And that was the problem. That was always the problem with us. We stayed too long in moments like this. We let them stretch until they meant more than we were ready to handle. And I felt it then, that pull, quiet but undeniable, the same one that had been there all night, building in small, almost unnoticeable ways. And before I could overthink it, before I could step back or shut it down, I shifted just slightly closer, closing the last bit of distance between us, not touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the steady presence that used to feel like something I could rely on. And his breath caught, just for a second, like he had not expected that, like he had been holding himself back and was not sure what to do now that I was not. And the silence that followed was different from before, not heavy, not tense, but charged, like something fragile and important had just shifted into place, and I could see it in his expression, that same hesitation, that same awareness, like we were both standing on the edge of something we did not fully understand yet. And I felt my chest tighten, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of everything this moment carried, everything it could mean if we let it. And I said, barely above a whisper, "I do not know what happens next," because that was the truth, the only honest thing left. And he did not look away, did not step back, just held my gaze and said, just as quietly, "Then we figure it out." And something about the way he said it, simple and certain, settled into me in a way I was not prepared for, not a promise, not a guarantee, just a possibility. And I realized, sitting there with him as the storm raged outside and the world beyond the cabin disappeared into white, that maybe this was not about fixing what broke. Maybe it was about deciding whether we were willing to try again, knowing everything we knew now. And for the first time since he walked through that door, I did not feel like running.